Hello and welcome to the SciPhi Show. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
I'm Martijn.
And I'm Philip.
And today we are going to be having a discussion on free speech. So this is a topic that I can imagine a lot of people have a lot to say about. It's something that often comes up in debates online, conversations about things like censorship. Oh my God, I can't say censorship. Censorship. There you go. Got all tongue tied.
Linguistic difficulties.
Yet again, another speech issue on our stream about free speech. This is amazing. We're only 5 minutes in. And all that sort of thing. So I think what we should do is maybe start at the beginning and talk about, what is actually meant by free speech. So Martijn, would you like to give us a quick rundown of what free speech is?
Yeah, sure. In a single line, it's basically a protection from the government for punishing you for any kind of speech.
So when you say it's from the government, is that you saying that it's something that's actually given by the government?
It's a law that restricts the government. It's typically a constitutional right, so the government can't just go on and change that. So it's sort of given by the government because it's held there by the government, but it's also not really given by the government because it's been given by previous governments. Sort of. Yeah.
That's fair. So are there places around the world that don't have this right?
China. Russia. Iran. Saudi Arabia. Egypt, I believe, but I'm not sure.
So a lot of people would think this right is supposed to be inalienable. But if it's not something that is even a basic human right, clearly it can't be.
I mean, I think the United Nations actually have it written down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that it is supposed to be at least a sort of a basic human right in a way. But I think this is maybe a good point to start on because I think a lot of different people mean different things when they talk about free speech, right? Like you can talk about it legislatively, when it comes to the government specifically, but I think there are many contexts in which it gets brought up that are not strictly related to the government, right? Where we're talking about a broader point. So I think it's very interesting maybe to try to categorize what we might mean when we talk about free speech, the different things that people might sort of have in mind when they talk about free speech. Like for instance, a lot of people tend to talk about free speech when they sort of get restricted on a specific platform maybe or something like that, right? That's where it gets brought up a lot. Even though that doesn't strictly have to do with the government, right? I mean,
it's a private platform, isn't it? So it's owned privately. It's not a government-owned platform. And another thing you could say, though, just because speech is free, does it always mean that you're free of consequences of what you say? Even from the government in some circumstances. Like if you're I don't know, starting riots and things like that, should you still be free to say what you like, or free from the consequences of the fact that you've incited this riot?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, right? Because certainly you get a lot of people sort of bringing up free speech when they get criticized for some things, right? I find it very amusing when someone is when you criticize someone, right? And they're like, you're trying to censor me, even if you're just sort of expressing you shouldn't have said that or something, as if I'm trying to sort of that's just an opinion or something, right? About what your sort of opinion is. It's not trying to censor it or actually censoring you, right? it's a different point. Actually, ironically, it is sort of like a free speech act when you sort of express your opinion about someone else's opinion, right, on something.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of sensitivity here or a lot of times when free speech gets sort of used as a free pass ticket to really not be criticized, right? Like, because any critique seems like gets sort of dismissed as if it is about free speech, and I think that is part, like that categorizes a lot of the issues I think I have when it comes to free speech today.
I mean, on that, I think Dave and I actually experienced someone a year or two ago who had an odd notion of free speech, and it was something along the lines of, I can say whatever I like and no one can tell me I'm wrong, because that's what free speech is.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about now.
Oh, man.
And free speech means you don't get to tell me I'm wrong. But
According to who?
I can tell you you're wrong because you don't have free speech in the UK.
Oh my God, was that an actual point?
That was an actual point. And you'll know who it is. I think I
remember. Yeah.
Wow.
Like that.
Yeah. So I think you're right there, Philip. I think there are slightly different takes on what is meant by free speech. There is what we're talking about from the government, sort of like a given right, but there's also people thinking that it means other things. So did you have any other examples there that you wanted to cover off as well?
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting. I would like to discuss, for example, how people tend to defend free speech, because like maybe at some point we should discuss our opinions on free speech. I think that could be helpful to frame the discussion, right? I'm not trying to make it a political sort of framework as much as possible, but I think it is inevitable at some point. But I also want to use this discussion to sort of refine my ideas on it, right? The ones that I have. But I think, for example, even people that do think that free speech is important, and I would count myself among them, right? I think a lot of people would agree with that, actually, right? But there is then just sort of a spectrum of how much you sort of how strongly you feel about that, right? How many exceptions are you willing to make there? But even among people who are very sort of, maybe extreme is not the right word here, but they're very sort of absolutist about it, right? They would defend it perhaps in different ways, right? Some people would say that it is like an intrinsically good thing, right? So it doesn't have to be justified in any way why it is good, right? But it is sort of like an intrinsic good, that free speech is some sort of like basic right and good that we have. And then there would be other people that are sort of like thinking of it as a contingent good, right? Like that it is good, but it is good because of some further thing that we may want to discuss, right? And I think among these two people, even though they are maybe both sort of absolutist about it, they would still sort of handle things differently, right? But when it comes to the discussion surrounding free speech. So I think there are many different avenues that you can take, I suppose, when discussing this issue. And it's perhaps something that is worth exploring. I don't know. I felt that maybe this would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be hard to get away from the political side of free speech. Even if it's a more basic form of government. I mean, if we think back to state of nature, I suppose you are ultimately free to say whatever, but then you're also not protected in any way from someone not liking what you say.
That's the thing, though. In a state of nature, you wouldn't be protected and wouldn't have the right to say whatever you like, because you would probably be too afraid of the biggest guy in the tribe to say what you like.
Right, yeah.
That's another very good point.
I mean, then you might even say that that's also coming into a form of government. I'm talking like there is not even like a tribal setting. Yeah, you could be free to say whatever you like, but you wouldn't be free from the consequences. So, and that's what I was trying to get at. So yeah, you move it into where we start. I mean, we're a social species, so we would have been grouping together, like you mentioned, and you wouldn't have felt free to say what you like. But does that mean you weren't free, or does it just mean that you were afraid of the consequences?
Oh, well, that's where I've always disagreed with Sartre, of course. I mean, he basically says that I have the freedom now to go out and try to slaughter the local police corps, but I'm not going to do it. I would say that at some point, the consequences are so grave that you indeed do not have the choice of that alternative.
That's an
Not
interesting
realistically, at
take,
least.
Yeah,
actually.
that's a very
So
interesting
the
take.
consequences are what actually restrict your freedom. So just because you could do it, because of the consequences, you won't do it. So therefore, you're not actually free.
Yeah, so there seems to be clearly a threshold, right? Because of course you could say that for anything, right? Like you could say that if someone sort of is threatening to kill you, right? You probably are not going to say, "Oh, I'm very free in the situation," right? If you can't do, like, let's say you have option A and option B, right? And someone says, "If you do option B, I'm going to kill you," right? You're probably not going to be feeling like you're completely free to choose between A and B, right? Because B has like a significantly higher consequence associated with it, right? But technically speaking, right, there's nothing stopping you from choosing B, right? It's just that the consequence that you would sort of endure or have to endure if you chose B is great, such that you don't feel free in that choice, right? So the question is like, how much of the like, where is the threshold of these consequences where you start to feel like you don't have a sort of a choice? Yeah, you don't have freedom, right? I think certainly there are certain things that we can think of that are easy, like, for example, being imprisoned, right, or threatened with your life, or threatened physically, or something like that.
Well, Lone Wolf has one. He says, keep in mind that there were societies who removed the tongues of slaves to ensure no speech at all. I mean, that's a very good example of not having any speech. So, yeah. So you're right? So there's certain consequences. And I suppose you could argue that any form of censorship as well is like removing that right. So could we say that there's also should be a limit on what you can say, as well as, should there be a limit on free speech, or should people actually be able to say whatever the fuck they like?
Maybe before we answer that, the question should be like, why would we want free speech in the first place? I think that's maybe a good place to start to then discuss if it makes sense.
So that we can have 200 definitions of atheism by next Tuesday.
Exactly. Ultimately, that's our agenda, right? Just admit it, right? We're here to muddy the waters, right? And we introduce a new definition of atheism every new week, right? So, yeah.
But Martin, you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I was going to say that it might make more sense first to see how we got free speech, something we all consider a good, of course, and see what we need to maintain it if we're going to set boundaries. Because one of the things that has been annoying me, and that is getting political, is that certain political parties in my country have been saying things about our judges and our jurisprudence and all sorts of things. They declare it to be dictatorial, or that we have activist judges, and you name it, right? And that is actively damaging the rule of law. And the rule of law is the whole structure around freedom of speech. So if you're going to break down that whole structure, eventually freedom of speech goes along with it, right? And so I do think that one of the limits that we should have that we don't have is that politicians should be restricted from saying anything that is potentially damaging to the rule of law.
Interesting, yeah. Should that just be limited to politicians and not the people?
I think that the people can rightfully complain about these kinds of things, but that the responsibility of being a politician is, for instance, to not even comment on trials at all. For instance, right? I mean, what is a politician doing commenting on another branch of government? That's weird.
So, I mean, you're
Right.
saying that they should stay in their lane, sort of. They've reached almost a pinnacle here, and they shouldn't be looking sideways, whereas us plebs at the bottom can complain about all of them.
Yeah, basically, we are subject to their decisions, so
Right, yeah.
we have a bigger right to complain, right?
Yeah.
That's basically it.
Fair. I mean, so basically English people have got it right because we moan about everything.
We do too. I'm thinking everybody does, because one of the things that we should also always wonder, complete tangent by the way, so is whether we need a government at all, and if we do, in what degree we do need them, because I think we may have overshot that one.
Could be right there. So if we think about that, then, so there's certain limitations that you would put on politicians. What about one that really, 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 I think should be enforced with politicians is, I think that they should be honest in what they're going to try and do. Right? They shouldn't lie. They shouldn't, make a big play out of their campaign speeches and all of that. So
here's the fun thing. I actually have a very recent story about this. This was last week, Thursday. So one of the politicians in my country got accused of being corrupt during a deal that would get us face masks for COVID, right? Because he had another party member who had a company, and he got the deal, and it was worth 100 million, and the face masks were eventually useless, of course. So yeah, but the funny thing is, it is proven that he has lied multiple times in this affair, just to cover up his involvement, right? And he actually lied his way out of the stand, out of a sort of, what do you say? Well, a debate, right, in which he could have been voted to leave. He actually saved his ass by saying, "I wasn't involved, even though I had some involvement." Yeah, let that one sink in.
do we need to go back to dialetheism there?
The point is, if you're trying to keep these people responsible for not lying, they're gonna lie their way out of it. That's basically the moral of the story, right?
They probably will, but I think the thing is, I mean, you think about like the campaign speech, just to bring it back to that. It's essentially their CV. This is why you should hire me as your country's leader. And if they then go against everything they do, now don't get me wrong, I can see certain situations where they might have to turn around and go, "Oh, we can't do that because of this," and so on and so forth, because something happens. I mean, a war breaks out, so okay, right, we can't focus on this thing. I'm sorry, but I think in general they should be trying to do what they say they're going to do, and it should be somewhat realistic. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think the entire political systems everywhere around the world needs to be changed, and but that's a completely different matter. But I think that they should be restricted to trying to be honest, and we should find some way of enforcing that more efficiently, and I don't see how he can get out of that. I mean, it's been demonstrated that he was lying through it, so how could he get away with something like that?
Oh, well, fairly simple. Because we have like 20 parties in our parliament right now. They all make alliances, right? So his alliance was big enough. That was just one more than the majority, right? So, he got let go, basically.
Fair. Well, not fair. Not fair.
No.
Not just at all. But
No, not at all. But
No.
hey, that's how the cookie crumbles, I guess.
Unfortunately so. So, I mean, there's at least 2 restrictions I think should be on politicians. But what about people? Just people. Or like everyone. So it includes politicians perhaps as well, but everyone. For example, things like hate speech. You know, should people be allowed to spread biased, bigoted, nasty comments? Should they be able to say these things? Should people be able to spread absolute falsehoods, things that are demonstrably false, that can be proven to be false? You know, where should there be a general threshold, or should there not be one at all?
That's a very interesting question. I'm very conflicted about that one. I think I do think. Okay, let's put it this way. I do think that speech, right? I mean, people who think that, you know, sticks and stones can break my bones, but sort of words, they can't hurt me or something like that. They are sort of deluding themselves, I think, right? Like that needs to be first established, right? Like there can be systems in place that are just purely verbal, right? That count as abusive, and they do tons and tons of damage, right? To the point where they actually make someone just suffer and even sort of commit suicide and kill themselves, right? So there clearly are sort of systems of speech, but I do think that these are more sort of like systemic issues, right? That I think should be restricted, like personally speaking, right? I do think that if you're sort of in a setting where you and a group of other individuals can act as a sort of bully type scenario, right? Where you're sort of creating an environment where just verbally you're making it sort of psychologically traumatizing for certain people to exist, right? To the point where they start sort of harming themselves or even killing themselves, right? That should be restricted, right? I don't think that you should be able to do that. That being said, though, right, I think someone just hating on someone, right? Like if it's a sort of localized scenario, right? If you insult someone, if you do all these types of things, which I don't personally like, right? But I don't think that these should be restricted personally, right? I think the restrictions should start to come into place when the environment starts to change in such a way that people like are starting to suffer because of the sort of dialectical environment, if you will.
Right. So I mean, just to cut in there. So if I was to start insulting you, let's say I was actually doing it to be nasty, but it doesn't really affect you, right? Water off a duck's back. You don't really care about my opinion of you. So I use any form of language or anything like that. You think that that's something that shouldn't be enforced. Yet if you, for example, let's say you had some condition or something like that I started making fun of, that would obviously make it a bit different. I'm not just insulting you for being you, I'm insulting something that you can't even control about yourself or something like that. Do you think that's where it starts to bend?
I also have a question. Who in this scenario is going to be doing the enforcing?
Yeah, that's another good question, I think. Like I don't know, and it's like we tend to usually speak about the government, right, when we talk about free speech.
It's different in a workplace because obviously, again, it's not necessarily government owned, so they can actually say no, you're not allowed to insult each other in any way, shape, or form.
Sure, but I do, like, for example, I've seen what Luke said in the chat, for example, before, right? That wait a minute, I'm just trying.
How
to
do you people
comment.
see the chat?
I opened YouTube and popped the chat out.
Oh, okay. All right, let me do that. That's fun.
That free speech should protect from the government, but it does not protect against people deplatforming. So if I choose not to give someone space to speak, that is not restricting someone's free speech, right? And in general, I do tend to agree with that, right? But I do think that, for example, say like a hypothetical, say that hypothetically, like all the places where you can express or exercise your free speech, right, are owned by a single individual, right? As a hypothetical, right? then technically, right, I'm not being restricted from the government, right? But given the fact that all the places, right, say that all sort of public squares or online or everywhere, right, all printing houses, publishing places, right, everywhere is owned privately, but by a single individual, right? Of course, in that scenario, I would say that this individual sort of doing whatever he wants, right, because it's his sort of private space, still is restricting in a sort of way your speech, right? And I think like if you're not clear on why sort of free speech is important, then we're not going to catch that, right? If you just sort of focus on the relationship with the government, right, for which it was initially designed, we're not going to catch all of these sort of scenarios that can occur, which I do think are sort of important to consider when sort of the places where speech is usually expressed is sort of privately owned, for example, right? I do think that there are issues there, for example.
Well, here's the thing. I do think that in some ways, deplatforming someone, like kicking them off of Twitter or Facebook, is in some way an impediment to their free speech rights. That's mainly because these social media, they have a very clear public function.
Yeah.
A public function that is not being done by anything else. So I would say that we should actually regulate them and possibly disown them as a as a public good.
Yeah, I kind of have sympathies for that view as well. If you're gonna get, ironically, right, a lot of people that tend to be like very sort of free speech absolutists that tend to also be sort of like very and not really a fan of regulation from the government, let's say in private companies' business, right? But like I think there's sort of like a bit of a conflict there usually when they sort of they try to argue that they should be allowed to do something, right? But at the same time, any private company can do whatever the fuck they please, essentially, right? Like there tends to be a bit of tension there usually. But apart from that, I do think that if someone gets sort of restricted from using sort of all the major public platforms, right, that there is some sort of there is a concern there, I think. I'm not exactly sure how much of a concern it is, because technically, right, there are certain other ways that you can communicate still, right? It's not like you completely cut off. It's not like a ban from the government, right, where you like literally would face prison for sort of
that Black Mirror episode. Do you know where they were? Have you seen that? Right, where offenders were actually like completely blurred out and they couldn't talk to anyone, or do you remember that one?
I haven't seen that one.
I stopped watching after the Killer Bee Twitter thing. That was them, right?
Killer Bee Twitter?
Yeah, wasn't that them?
Yeah, the cops investigating the robotic bees.
Yeah,
that were used to kill people. Yeah,
that
was cool though.
Yeah, they've got a lot of great episodes. I didn't really make much of the last couple of seasons. I like season 1 to 3, but there were some good episodes in the last seasons, but just anyway, going off.
Netflix screwed it up.
Yes, they did. Like when they got season 3, it was like a blend of old and new, and it was like, oh, this is still kind of cool. And then it was like, no, now it's just a Netflix show where we're rehashing all the old ideas and doing it in a really crap way.
So basically, like Disney Plus. Sorry, I had to make a job.
So Luke brings something to the conversation where he says, let's be clear, hate speech isn't just insulting someone. Now, I completely agree with this. It's also not simply just telling someone that, oh, well, I'll give you a kick or something like that. There's a little bit more to hate speech than that. So, Dave, would you like to just give us a breakdown of what hate speech is?
Okay, that's kind of difficult.
That's why it was given to you.
Hate speech, yeah, of course. You could sort of argue that hate speech is designed to create underlying tensions that are brought forth in the public space against certain groups of people or certain types of people or even a certain individual. Not just in the sense of wanting to mock them, but wanting to harm them. cause them actual harm, that kind of thing. It's designed to create hate within the public sphere. So if you think about how the Nazi propaganda worked, that was designed to create a feeling of hatred within the community or, the country. So it wasn't just saying Jews are terrible. It was, if you see one, throw them in a camp.
Yeah, that's a powerful example.
Like a really basic sort of
yeah, but it's powerful all the same. It doesn't need to be complicated, and it's something that I think everybody can actually, identify with. Those sort of stories. So this is one of the things that I find a little bit frustrating about social media, because they've become so restrictive of what they regard as hate speech. And I've had bans from both Twitter and Facebook for hate speech. And it's not something that I've done, right? So on Facebook, my friend was telling me about how he liked setting up IKEA furniture. So I said, I've just got a new wardrobe. Come over and I'll cook you a meal and we'll have a good night. It's like, getting rewarded for things that you love, it turns it into a job, and I don't really want that to happen. Just a bit of banter. And I said, all right, well, I'll kick you and make you work and not feed you anything and whip you whilst I'm doing it, sort of thing. And complete joke, but obviously that got me banned from Facebook for 48 hours. And I was like, I appealed it, and I was like, it's just a bit of banter. Read the whole conversation, you'll see how it's gone. Like, no. And on Twitter, I quoted a Bloodhound Gang song and actually atted them. And it was a title of their song, the first track on Hooray for Boobies, which is I Hope You Die.
I remember that tweet. That tweet.
I was just like, what? Now, both of these obviously had a context to them that would make them not hate speech. But just reading them by themselves, would they be regarded as hate speech if you didn't know the context?
I would see it more as angry speech than hate speech.
Yeah, I think I would agree.
Yeah. It doesn't call to action. It doesn't state that you intend to take an action, and it doesn't ask people to take another action.
It doesn't encourage people to do it or anything.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, but I think, to the point that I made earlier, right? I think this type, if we remove the context, right, and say that you actually said, right, I want you to die or something like that, right? And this was like a thing that was not just you, right? But there was like an entire sort of network of people that did this, right? I think it can create an environment, right, where especially if it's targeted against a certain group of individuals, right, where it's, I mean, you're not directly saying it, right, but maybe even inadvertently, you're making up an environment that actually can physically harm people as well, right? Not to mention psychologically. So I think there's a bit of a conversation around that. I think that is interesting because it's not exactly clear to me where the line is sometimes. Because again, you might even be unaware when you're doing certain things, right, that you're part of a bigger sort of thing. And certainly this happens to some individual, right? Maybe you have a particularly tough week, I don't know, on Twitter or something, right, where you end up in the worst places, right, and then you just feel psychologically completely destroyed, right? But now imagine that so much worse where you don't have anywhere else to go, right, where it's constantly that type of thing, right? Then it can be very, very bad and very hurtful, and harmful to individuals. So I think there's a bit of that needs to be cleared up, but I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to work.
That ties into something Daniel Kelly said, actually. He says, I think free speech against the government must always be protected, but violent language in society probably does deserve some protections. Words can be as violent as fists. But you're also right. It's like, how do you find out where that's lying? Obviously, I've been picked up by an algorithm, from what I said, that has assumed that the worst possible reading, the absolute worst possible reading, and added to it of what I said. But yeah, I don't know. How do we find the balance? And where is that line, like you said? Because there could be something that I say to you that doesn't affect you in any way, shape, or form, but it could affect someone else greatly. So again, we need almost an arbitrary line there in the sand of where is this acceptable level?
I have a very good idea for that.
Oh yeah.
I have for years been a great proponent to the right of personal conflict, which in short would mean that when you are targeted by, for instance, hate speech, you get the right to proportionally and personally confront the person who said those and apply a proportional amount of violence. Should that violence then again be met with resistant violence, you get a fight, right? But then it basically best man wins. Just again, not disproportionately, so none of them should die, ideally. Yeah, it sounds rough, right? But it's I think one of the most efficient ways to police it. I think it's also a more satisfying way, obviously, than being policed. And I also do think that in some measure you should allow people some autonomy over the resolution of their own conflict.
Do both people need to be in agreement of what that resolution is? So, for example, if someone just says, I want you to leave me alone, and the person doesn't leave them alone, is that more of a, right, this is something that needs to be dealt with? Whereas if someone will leave them alone, otherwise, it'll turn into something more, like should there be almost that agreement there? Like, it's not an exact agreement, but it goes, you have a choice, right? You can leave me alone, you can stop with this shit, and we'll leave it there, or I'm telling you now, this is going to escalate. Okay, this is going to escalate past the verbal because what you're doing is inappropriate. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, well, of course, you would ideally try to settle it with words first. That seems normal, right? But yeah, in some cases that won't be a possibility, and I do think that in some measure, sometimes people really do need to just hash it out. I mean, I'm not the tough guy who's gonna do it, man. I'm still gonna call the cops. Let's be honest about that. I'm not the tough guy here telling us to get to go beat up people. But I do think that in some measure, yeah, you should just have that freedom. I mean, yeah.
Do either of you want to weigh in on that?
I don't know exactly what I think about that. I'm trying to process it, I suppose. I'm not exactly sure how far that could extend and all the possible implications, both good and bad, of that idea. So I'm like, intuitively it seems a bit extreme to me, but at the same time, like maybe it's just a seeming, right? Maybe it's actually, if you look into it, then maybe it would be sort of doable and maybe not lead to all these sort of scenarios that can sort of come to mind. But yeah, I think these are my thoughts on the thing.
What about you, Dave?
I'm not sure a society based on allowing people to beat each other up because they've been insulted is the kind of society that we really want to live in.
That's fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, confrontation, I don't necessarily think needs to involve sort of physical confrontation, right? But
is there a certain level? I mean, what Martin was actually saying was a proportionally adequate response. So I don't think it's just someone turning around and going, "Oi, you're a bald dickhead," and going, "Right, I have the right to punch you."
No. This is
Yeah.
purely in reference of hate speech, man. This is not just insultment. This is
Okay.
this is like somebody on the street corner saying all N-words must die. And I think that if you are a black person walking past him, you're allowed to first tell him like, "Dude, what the fuck are you doing, man?" And if he doesn't listen, then I think I'm not too sympathetic to somebody getting beaten over the head for those things.
I think it should be discouraged, but I think if it comes to that in that sort of scenario, then it should be taken into context when any
I think it's
charges are
understandable,
applied
right?
or
Like it's
anything.
definitely understandable if it happens. Yeah.
But it's not something that should be encouraged because it really should be.
I'm not saying you should encourage it. No,
Yeah,
no.
it's something that the government should be taking care of, and we as a society should be taking care of, because that's the whole point of societies.
I think that's a very good point. Just to segue, it's like when schools don't do anything about bullying, right? I mean, this is at a younger age. You learn, unfortunately, that people aren't going to protect you. They're either going to join in with the bully or they're going to hide from the bully, or the teachers aren't going to do anything. And then if you do go to the teachers, the bullying is going to get worse, and so on and so forth. And the only thing you can do in this situation seems to be taking on the bully. And I don't think that's the right way. I think the teachers should be doing it first and foremost, obviously. And in this example, I mean, that's the government. But if the government aren't doing it, people as a society should be trying to deal with this. And I suppose that's what you do get where people are picketing, and they are having marches and so on and so forth to try and make changes. But again, if it comes back to government, if government don't make adequate changes, then you still have the same problem. So then you're back to Martin's example. Well, if the only thing left to do is knock someone out.
It's the direct action approach, right? I mean, if somebody else isn't going to do it, let me do it. And because let's be honest, realistically, whether or not somebody is persecuted for hate speech is really very, very much dependent on the prominence of the person perpetrating the hate speech. So only when it's a known politician or some kind of fucking artist or some shit, only then there's going to be some prosecution. But some random guy on the street here could be doing just as much damage, and they won't even try to investigate it.
Yeah, though I think that if you have like a certain position, right, and you in a certain position of power, then you likely have much more of an impact with what you say than some random guy on the streets, right? So I think it does make sense that there is a relationship there between persecution of higher level individuals that can spread these ideas to a broader population in a way that can sort of incentivize and make it easier for these environments to occur that are sort of very toxic to people that live within, right? So yeah.
I mean, Luke had a comment that's sort of related to all this, saying, if we allow all speech, then harassment laws have to get thrown out the window. Sexual harassment, bullying, homophobia, racism, then they're all permissible. And I mean, I think that's it. I think if you're arguing for complete free speech, but even then, I think that most people will say, well, there's still restrictions on that. Yeah, there's free speech, but there's consequence. Especially in certain environments like businesses and things like that. Like, do you know what? Maybe your government isn't doing anything about sexual harassment, but this company is.
No. That's basically what I'm saying. That's community policing.
Yeah.
That's basically what I propose.
And I think there needs to be more of it. But does that mean that we... You'll just end up with another police force if it goes on further.
Or vigilantes.
Yeah. And Batman. So
okay.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
And I just wanted, maybe we haven't discussed this yet, right? I don't think we have. Like, why is free speech important in your view, right? Like, what is the function of it? Why do we care about it in the first place?
It's a very good question. Would either of you like to field that?
I mean, I can answer for myself.
You can go first.
By you, do you mean me or?
Well, I meant Joe, because you know, it sounded like you were asking.
Yeah, I was
dodging all the
yeah.
questions. He's a politician, this one.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question. I think that I think there's a lot to be said for limitations on free speech. I don't actually think that we should have total free speech, but I also don't like censorship as well. I think that there should be limitations. You know, we should be free as long as what we're saying is honest and true, and in the best interests of people. So I probably would say that I don't necessarily believe in total free speech. I don't think that complete free speech is as important as some other people will, right? I don't think that. I think there's a lot that can go on that can be destroyed by complete free speech. But I still think people can say what they want, but there should be a consequence if what they are doing is demonstrably false or inciting violence and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I guess I'm arguing against a little bit of free speech there. You know, I'm not completely on the side of it.
Do you mind if I go?
Go for it.
Okay, so I would say that free speech is important for many different kinds of reasons. The first is that you can't actually be yourself unless you're free to express yourself. And this isn't just in speech. Speech is something very personal to us. And that's why we feel like when we're being restricted, a certain part of us is being stopped from being us. But there's also freedom of expression. So like speaking through artwork, speaking through placards, all these things are important. And we live in a society where we need to be able to feel like we can actually shape our environment. And we, you know, we can be sort of self-guiding to some degree at least. And we need to be able to speak out against injustices, corruption. And I think if we're not free to express ourselves, then it pretty easily opens the door to something like totalitarianism.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd agree with you there, Dave. I think it's like we were saying at the beginning, where we've got this looking up at the government and all the different parts of the government. It's completely fine, but if you're inciting someone for just because you're a racist and you're trying to incite violence against a particular race, I think that, you know, is coming back to the whole hate speech thing. I think that they're fine. You say it, but you're going to be pulled up on it. You're going to be policed. I think they should be policed. But, is it a case of they should be policed by the government, or should they be policed by society, like non-governmental society?
Well, that's why if you start with why it's important, then you can start to understand why certain parts of restricting it are also important.
Yeah, that's fair. What about you, Martin?
Well, I think I basically agree with Dave. I mean, it's very important, of course, to be able to differ, to be able to protest. And my other reason was we just like to talk, which is basically what Dave mentioned with the identity, right? Also, especially children, when growing up, make some egregious errors sometimes when they exercise their freedom of speech. So we should probably forgive them for that, right?
Someone to be
And
pulled up on it so that they learn that it's wrong. They can be forgiven, but
yeah,
you know.
but that's exactly what I'm getting to. I think a very big part of the freedom of speech is also a societal issue, which we've been glossing over a bit today. But it makes it possible for us to show other people what kind of orthodoxy we do find. Yeah, what basically what's the societal orthodoxy, right? I mean, through canceling people, right? We are showing that some sorts of thought patterns and some sorts of well, yeah, behaviors and all those kinds of things are just not acceptable in our society, and that we all disapprove. And I think that too is a very powerful thing, and possibly I'm rambling. So off to you. Yeah.
So does that answer your question well enough, Philip, or is there anything you wanted to cross-examine there?
I think I want to add to this. I think speech is fundamentally extremely important in the way sort of we as societies figure out what's true, right? It is an essential component of that. And this ties also into sort of a discussion about echo chambers, right? If the prominent idea at this point has the power to not even allow for sort of other ideas to be surfaced, right? It is very easy for the society to progress in such a way that it makes it extremely hard for competition for the dominant idea at the moment to arise, right? Essentially, and that is you could see this as a very good thing, right? In the case in which the dominant idea at this particular moment in time is the correct one, right? Because then we can keep this dominant idea for longer, maybe, or it has a lower risk of being overtaken by other ideas, right? And stuff like that. But in the case in which this idea is not correct, right, then it is sort of very hard to change it, right? It makes it very hard to, or if not impossible, to overtake this idea, right? And I think speech is like the lowest level in which we sort of start to figure out what truth is. So restricting sort of the tool with which we help ourselves to figure out what's true seems sort of like a problematic thing if you care about what's true, right? Because like you want to be able to restrict the level above that, but I don't know if you want to restrict the level below that. And I'm saying this as someone that is fully aware and fully supports certain restrictions on free speech, right? I don't want anyone to get the idea that I'm a sort of like super absolutist, but maybe I'm more towards that than some people in here, right? So I think these are sort of my ideas about why I would think that free speech is important, because I also fear, like, although I absolutely share, right, the idea that, for example, certain ideas are correct and certain ideas are absolutely awful, right? I'm also kind of always, like, in the back of my head, there's always this sort of bug that tells me, right, but that's sort of how I feel at the moment, right? And for the person that feels the exact opposite way, right, they have the same mental state as I have, right, but about the opposite state, right, of affairs. And so at that point, I would like to figure out if I'm in the right state of affairs, and it seems like it would be much harder to do that if the other state of affairs is sort of enabled to get to me, right, in a way.
Well, I think with that, there's also, you're starting at different points though, aren't you? You're saying, well, I think this is true and I think this is true, but there isn't. I think that's a bit different to perhaps restrictions on certain forms of speech. I think if you're,
I think it's fair to say that. I think, like, if you, as we mentioned before, right, if you have an influence and say, go kill these people, right, then suddenly that's a different type, really, of speech that is not about figuring out what is true. It's more like about directing a certain group of individuals to do something, right?
Yeah,
So
or if
that's
like you've got a particular disease and you go and tell people to take a particular horse dewormer or
yeah, just completely coincidental.
And that's exactly the problem. In this day and age, we are seeing more and more conspiracy theories and pieces of misinformation, specifically geared towards the way we see the free market of ideas work, right?
But then, just with that though, I think if someone, there's a difference again with someone going, hang on, would this product work? Let's have a look at it. Let's examine it. I know it might seem unlikely. I know it could seem out there, but let's just see if this product, under a microscope could work and see if it has any benefits, right? I mean, it wouldn't, but let's just say, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone questioning that, right? Just putting that out there, saying, let's build an experiment. But telling people, right, go use this product. Your government's lying to you, man. This will cure you. You don't need no vaccine. Go get this thing. Right. Okay. That's a completely different statement, right?
Yeah, but that's also a complete commercial. What we see happening really is that these conspiracy theories, they play into literally every bias a human has. Like if you look at them closely, there's not a bias you can't see being exploited, and that is not an accident, my friend. That is by design.
Yeah.
And that is where free speech is actively protecting a producer of untruth.
Sure.
That was my point, right?
Yeah, but I do agree that, right, like if you allow for free speech, like in the extreme sense, right, you're definitely going to have more, like you're going to run into the risk of seeing more false ideas, right? That's just the nature of it, right? And definitely there is a risk of these ideas to spreading, right? Essentially, I suppose that I'm not sure if I'm convinced that the alternative is better in these types of scenarios, right? I think it's sort of like a bad thing. Clearly, it is a bad thing, but I don't know if, I think it would be sort of a case by case thing for me. Maybe, right? Like seeing how much damage a certain thing is doing. But then again, like I'm very aware, maybe too much sometimes, that maybe I'm just in this echo chamber, right? Like that because it's very easy to label everything that you disagree with as a conspiracy theory, right? And I do think that these are conspiracy theories, right? I do most definitely think that they're conspiracy theories, right? But at the same time, right, like maybe these people say the same thing about my thing, or they say, oh, did you just believe whatever the government says to you, or whatever other shit, right? Like they have their own reasons, exactly, right? They think that they have it figured out, right? And I think that I have it figured out and categorize them correctly, and they think that they have me figured out and that they are categorizing me correctly, and they have sort of the right set of things, right? So I find it very hard to use that as a basis to restrict speech, but I'm conflicted about these types of things, right? That's partially why I wanted to talk about it as well, because I'm not exactly sure, where I stand.
I think you could be right there. I mean, I think there is possibly. I agree with you on the case by case basis. I don't think that necessarily you could make a rule for all. Is there actually any harm doing, and then so on and so forth. But I think when you can demonstrate that this is something that is going to definitely do more harm than good, and you provide someone with this reasoning, again, it's difficult, but if we go back to the dewormer, should people have the right to do that to themselves? I mean, you could argue that perhaps they have the right to take dewormer if they want. Maybe they shouldn't give it to their kids, though. Maybe that's child endangerment, right? But yeah, okay, they have the right to do that to themselves. But should they be restricted in spreading the misinformation? And the people that told them, should they be accountable for the negative fallout?
The people that told them should definitely be held accountable, because if you go far back enough, those are the people who caused it, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
You can actively show damages, so that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
But
should they then? But should they still have the right to say it in the first place, but be accountable for all the damage? You know, should they still be free to say it? You know, but there's the consequence, and the consequence is what makes them less free.
Well, I think that if we take what I said earlier, and we now have regulated social media as a public arena, we should allow it, but do those little notifications that they do these days. You know, like this could be misinformation. Read the truth here. We should probably do it for like everything. But yeah, they should be allowed to spread it. Sort of. It does feel uncomfortable, but I guess that's the sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
I think I kind of tend to agree with that, right? I think
free to say it, but not free from the consequences.
Like if someone figures out, right, that they knew the truth, right, and they lied about it, right? Like say that there's like an investigative journalism report, right, and they figure out, oh, this person knew about the negative effects, consequences, whatever, right, and they lied and spread this misinformation. At that point, right, it's not really the act of saying it that you're sort of condemning, right? It's more like the act of knowing that this was harmful and saying it, and knowing that you saying it in the position that you are and occupy, right, is going to cause this and this much harm in society, right? So I think that is perfectly fine to persecute, right, in a way, because it's not really the act of saying it that you're persecuting there. But at the same time, like there are other arguments that you can use, right? And I've seen these arguments time and time again from people, even that I really don't like that much, right? To be honest, but I kind of find them like at least partially compelling, right? Like for example, the idea that if you don't let these people sort of have a certain or be sort of in the public discussion, right? That they can, it's much easier for them to sort of confine themselves in an echo chamber. Right. And we see this with algorithms today on Twitter as well, right? Where you sort of find people that agree with you and then you get fed all the information that agrees with you. That is already a problem, right? But it's sort of even more exasperated, I suppose. I don't know if that's the correct word, right, in term. But if they then get sort of their own space to talk about this shit, right, where they don't get to be challenged, right, on any of this, right, it can be sort of a fertile breeding ground for all of this crap, right, where you don't have the opportunity to change their minds even, right? You don't have all these things that we like to talk about often, right, which are sort of these when you discuss it with someone, right, respectfully an issue, right, then you might get to affect the listeners, right, that look at this conversation, right, maybe decide to see that, oh, so this is not as unreasonable as originally thought, for example, right, and then they start to think about this for themselves, and then you might get a chance, right? But if you sort of separate these things into their own clouds, you're sort of killing the chances of these things. And by clouds, I mean sort of networks of people interacting, right? I'm sorry if that was confusing, right? But these networks of people interacting, if you're dividing them, right, and you're never letting them sort of weave into each other, then I think it's much harder for, like, because one of them is incorrect, right? One of these networks is going to be incorrect if they maintain opposite positions, right? So one of them is going to be harder for one of them to discover the truth, I suppose, right? Because they're always going to be fed the information filtered through the lens that they already accept, right? So I'm very conflicted about these sorts of issues, right? Because at the same time, I do think that it shouldn't be allowed, right, for, again, as I said before, right, for a group of people to make an environment such that a certain other group of people is brought to the point of actually self-harm or psychological, complete like psychological torture, right? but it's a balancing act, I suppose, right? It's not exactly clear all the time.
I agree. This is one of the things that I don't actually like about sort of the social media environment for a lot of conversations. I think you're right that there is almost, you get fed the same content because you tend to follow people that are of similar-ish dispositions to you with most things. But there are people who actively go out and look for someone they disagree with, and they are generally not that pleasant to them. They'll do the whole quote tweet thing. And I hate the negative quote tweet. I mean, sometimes I agree it might be needed with certain things, especially if you're quote tweeting someone demonstrating how hateful this person is. But some people, let's just say they're saying they thank God for their good life, right? We're all non-theists. There's three of us that are atheists. I can't remember. I think you're an apatheist, aren't you, Martin?
Yeah, I don't give a fuck. Yeah.
So, but the people jumping on them, quote tweeting, "Oh, look at this fucking idiot who doesn't know what he's doing," and then you get their entire circle getting on them and maybe joining the original thread and then attacking all the other people, and this can actually have ongoing negative consequences past it. And they're not actually addressing the issue. They're not doing what we said earlier about hashing out the ideas. They're literally just insulting each other. Now, this insulting isn't what we're talking about in hate speech, but sometimes it can sort of get to the point where someone could be so demoralized by all the hate that they've got online that it does really, really affect them. So again, you're stuck trying to police something that can't really be policed.
Yeah, again, like I maintain that free speech is a sort of a contingent good, right? Like that it is good, right? Absent other reasons, we should allow it as much as possible, right? But of course, there are scenarios in which the momentary harm that you get from allowing certain kinds of speech, right, outweighs the other sort of possible goods that it provides, right? But it's like just the discussion about like the scenarios in which this is appropriate, right? That sort of requires free speech in a way, right? Like you're already using speech there to determine whether or not a certain scenario is the one that you fear, right? And like it just seems like a chicken and an egg problem, right? At some point, like how the hell do you get out of this in many ways? And I do think that, like, for example, I do like some tools like that social networks, for example, provide that let you restrict what you see, right? And these tools are worth criticizing for the exact reasons that we did like many times, right? Where people get stuck in echo chambers, right? And they get misused. And you should, as much as possible, I think, allow for as many disagreeing opinions, right? That's a general opinion that I hold, right? That they reach you so that you're better informed, that you're better able to counter what other people think, that you actually have an accurate representation of what other people think that you disagree with. I think that's very important, for example, right? Because many times you get a distorted image of what I actually believe. But ultimately, right, if this type of stuff is actively harming you, right, I think you should be able to restrict and not see that, right? And I think social media allows you to do that, and I think that's a very good thing, right? So if certain people that you interact with just, you can't do that anymore, right? You can just restrict that. But at the same time, right, if the entire platform is that way, if like that's why I was talking about environments, right? If there's a like large proportion of the platform or the group or society in general that is treating you a certain way, right, then you cannot escape that, right? You cannot keep banning like half of the US population to not fucking see certain things, right? And at some point they start to affect you in ways that are actively harmful to you. And then at that point back comes the question, right? Like, should we do something about this? Because probably yes, we should, right? But all the things that I mentioned already come into play, and it's just a messy situation for me. And I'm kind of frustrated that I cannot figure out where I exactly stand on this.
Well, you're in luck because social media fucked it all up for you. The whole thing. If we didn't have social media, this would be so much easier.
Yeah, but at the same time, like I think a lot of people try to hate on social media, and rightfully so, right? Because there are many reasons to hate on social media, right? But like if you think back at a time where you didn't have this type of communication, right? People were stuck in their ideas in a way that it was like even worse than today in some ways, right? You were in your local community, what your local community believed, you believed as well, more or less, right? And good luck finding a way to out of that, right?
Yeah,
like how do you even get to reach other ideas without sort of this type of tool?
But that's exactly the thing that was better then. I mean, because they were all stuck in their own worldview, to do something effectively, they would have to come to a compromise, which means they were dependent on a shared reality. And when you look at people now, we tend to live in completely separate realities. I mean, if I talk to, and I have talked because someone at my work believes it, but if I talk to someone who believes in the whole QAnon thing, I notice that they are just in a completely different space, man. I mean, they were talking about how the Pope, I believe, wearing red shoes means that he's a pedophile or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is weird ass stuff, man.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So yeah, you need to force those things together to maintain some sort of internal cohesion. That's basically the whole point also of a multicultural society, which I am sorry to tell you, we don't really have, because we are all forced to be one culture. So we have a monocultural society with some diversities. That's basically the state we're in now. I mean, typically, I don't know. I believe Philip is in Italy. I have no idea what the population looks like there. So
they all look like Philip, every single one of them.
Yeah, we're all exactly the same.
And they drive these little mopeds around, and they go like, "Ciao."
Yeah, exactly. You have the exact same face as me, right? So if you come to Italy, right, don't say hello, because it's probably not me. It's just someone that looks exactly like.
Now, but in reality, of course, it could be that in more ethnically diverse centers, you have some more internal cohesion, which would eventually mean that those two worldviews get smashed together, right? So,
yeah.
Right, guys. We've got a few comments in the chat that I'm probably about 20 minutes behind in going through. I need to go and refill my drinks, so I'm going to chuck things into Be Right Back. And when we come back, we'll address any comments that have come in the chat. I will go back about 20-25 minutes, but if there's anything that you guys want us to address, please at us, and we'll go through it. And then we also have to address if free speech has been weaponized. So we'll be back in just about 3 or 4 minutes. Catch you guys in a sec. So just to cover off what we were saying before, we were discussing free speech, what it is, and why it is important in a number of areas, but there should possibly be certain either limitations or consequences, but it might need to be looked at a case-by-case basis, and is incredibly difficult to police and create a rule for any of it. So all in all, it's really difficult. I mean, that's a brief summary of the first hour. Was there anything else I missed from that?
No, that's about it.
No, that sounds about right. Yeah.
So coming on to the comments. So Luke says, this is why regulated speech of politicians is so important. There should be legal consequences for knowingly lying to the public. Parliament should be able to accuse each other of lies if they have reasonable grounds for such an assertion. I don't think we'd necessarily disagree with that.
No, I don't think we do. I don't know exactly how it relates to free speech, but I agree with that.
I disagree with it as long as you want a democracy, basically. Go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, I kind of agree. I don't think Parliament should be allowed to lie to the public, but I think they should be allowed to withhold certain information. Especially in times of a war or anything like that.
That's fair. Though then how do you qualify what that certain information is?
Troop movements, that kind of thing. They shouldn't be allowed to say anything that puts a troop in danger.
No, I completely agree with that. Yeah. But they shouldn't say everybody should eat this thing, but this thing will kill 50% of people.
Yeah, basically. Or maybe not be quite so honest about vaccines. How can I put it? They shouldn't have to report on how many people have died of a vaccine, just that people are dying and that there are certain situations that it might be, because you want people to still be encouraged to actually go and take something like the vaccines.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I always worry, right, that it might have the opposite effect of what you want, right, there, because then at some point, you might say, oh, why they're trying to hide it, right? Then some
something
might and they're gonna be like, right, look, they're
yeah.
trying to hide this crap, right, from you, and then that's gonna take over, right? Because it's true that you didn't say all the truth, right? You weren't transparent enough, and then what are they hiding, right? Maybe they had all that crap, right? So I'm always.
It's better for them to do it, but they shouldn't be forced to do it. But they should be forced to not lie,
Yeah, but that's another thing. I think Lone Wolf pointed this out, right? How do you know, for example, if someone knowingly lies, right? Because we're talking about knowingly lying.
I mean, if they're lying, then they do know it. I mean, lying requires consent.
Sure,
they're intentionally spreading a falsehood. But how do you prove that they knew that it was a falsehood?
Right? I think there are certain ways that you can do that, right?
I mean, if there's an email I send you and it says,
exactly.
Or something like that, or there's a recorded conversation,
yeah.
or there's enough people in a room that all turned around and said, no, he said this. He said he was going to say this. He knew that this was the fact.
Yeah.
So there are certain situations where you could say that, you can prove it. But there are certain things, I mean, we experience this all the time on social media, don't we? How do we know that someone is lying? Many of us atheists accuse theists of lying to people, but we would say that they're not necessarily lying. They might be spreading a falsehood, they might be spreading misinformation, but they truly believe what they're saying. But how would you prove that they are definitely lying, that they don't believe what they're saying in that situation?
When it comes to politicians, the politicians are typically politicians when they have an active seat, which means they are briefed. So they should know the truth. That's basically the whole point of being a politician, and not some regular Joe who can. Sorry, Joe. Who can randomly give his opinion and have it made into law, right? That's basically the whole point. But I do have another way to further complicate things.
Awesome.
Yeah. How about intentionally misleading rhetoric? So, as an example, in my parliament, they were talking about the 2022 refugee crisis in response to the war in Ukraine. And even before there were any refugees to report, right? And on the first fucking day of the invasion, it was already referred to by, you can guess what kind of parties, as a refugee crisis, right? And that is, of course, intentionally misleading, because there wasn't a crisis. There weren't even refugees. And you can, of course, predict that a lot of refugees are coming. That doesn't mean it's a crisis. In fact, we've had all kinds of heartwarming stories about how individual people are now harboring Ukrainians in their homes, and how Ukrainians are somehow getting paid more than welfare recipients, which is very interesting. But yeah. Anyway, very heartwarming, all of it, right? But that's the thing. There never was a crisis. There weren't any refugees. Yet there's a refugee crisis. Do we, if we're going to punish lying or in any kind of way, do we punish something like that? Because it is damaging. I mean,
it's definitely already inflammatory.
Yeah.
It's hard.
I think it's very. I would say no. I'd say I'll just go out on a limb and say no. Right? I think there are too many factors here that could be at play. Even though I don't like the rhetoric, right? I don't think. Like there's so many things that you could say about this scenario, right? You could say, oh, it was predicted that so and so many people would come, right? And we have so and so many places, right? And we wouldn't be able to get them or whatever, right? Like how do you distinguish between like someone just being wrong about the situation or like, I mean, slightly playing the cards in his favor, right?
This is just it.
Cherry picking certain information, right? But like all of us kind of do in certain scenarios, right? Like to be fair, because you kind of like this confirmation bias, right? That's part of being human.
Should it be based on how they act from there, though? Like the information comes out, right? This was a demonstrably false statement. There never was a crisis. How do you respond to that? And from there, do they stick in their sunk cost, dig their heels down, get really defensive? At that point, do they continue asserting that there was a crisis? And at that point, is it then punishable? Like how far does it go back?
That's the thing. I mean, you can't regulate a thing like that, man.
Yeah, I think you can't.
And whilst I do agree with Philip in his conclusion, I had something very profound to say and I just lost it. God damn it! Fuck. No, I lost it. That's too bad.
Happens to everyone.
That's
I wonder how many good ideas. Yeah. How many good ideas were lost?
It's a free speech impediment.
I like it. That's another issue for speech tonight as well. I wish I'd recorded when all of these
decided to lose it, right? There was no decision that you made to forget what you were about to say. So like that's definitely a restriction on your
self-censorship.
Yeah.
So Daniel Kelly has a point on the Parliament. So he says, indeed, we need to carefully find the balance so parliamentarians are protected from subversive commercial lawsuits while not protected from misleading the public. And I think that is, again, this comes back to the point. I think they're intentionally misleading the public, but then we go into an example like Martin gave, and if there was no real harm caused by the Martin's point, should they be, I don't know. It's difficult, isn't it? Have you remembered what you were going to say?
Yeah,
I was trying to jog your memory.
I was going to say that I agree with Philip that you shouldn't
that is very profound.
It too much, right? But I would say that using that kind of rhetoric is a form of hate speech, because it is actively damning. It is actively calling, at least in a political sense, for the discrimination of, in this case, the refugees in question. Mm-hmm. So I would say that it is effectively hate speech.
Yeah.
No, I think it does make sense, right? But then I could like cook up some very, very extreme, very, very hypothetical examples, right?
I think it's too easy to weasel out of at the end of the day.
Yeah, that too. I think. Yeah. But,
yeah, but that's that. Then we would call it hate rhetoric. I'm satisfied with that as well. The point is, it's hateful. It's speech. It actively promotes harming a group of people, a very strictly defined group of people, no less. So you could also say that it's some form of racism. So you see, all these kinds of things. I'd say it's hate speech, and I think I have a very, very strong argument there.
Okay. Yeah. That's something that I wanted to ask you even beforehand, not just you, Martin, but like everyone. Maybe as a broader point to provoke a bit, right? Like, do you think that if you say something like go and punch Nazis or something like that, right? Is that hate speech under your because like up until this point, from what we said, technically, right, it seems that would fall under the thing, right? Because it's a direct directive to harm a group of people, right?
But then you've got the paradox of intolerance.
That's true, right? You have a paradox of intolerance, I think, but we also have to, like, I think some people take the paradox of intolerance too far, I believe, right? Because technically, right, you shouldn't tolerate intolerance, right? That's absolutely true, right? Because if you tolerate intolerance, right, then you lose everything, essentially.
So what you're saying is we should throw bread at celiacs.
No, but the question is, like, what does it mean to tolerate, right, something?
Sorry, that was the worst joke I've probably come up with in forever. I can't help but giggle at it. And Dave's face was perfect.
I'm going.
Sorry, Philip. What were you saying?
Philip. Yeah, I've completely forgot.
I think I lost the point.
You were talking about not tolerating intolerance and how it can.
Yeah, exactly, right. The paradox of intolerance, right? Because
you go punch a Nazi. Yeah.
Yeah, if you so the paradox of intolerance, right? Essentially, if you tolerate intolerance, right, and don't do anything against it, right, eventually you're going to lose everything, more or less, right? Because the intolerant people then are not going to have your same mindset, and so they're going to not tolerate you or a specific group of individuals, and so eventually you're going to lose the things, right? So you're losing the very thing that you're trying to protect by tolerating intolerance, right? Yep. But then the question is, what exactly does it mean to like? Because it's not like if someone just speaks certain ideas, right? That doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to take over, right? It's not the same for like if someone. I just want to make the point that there is a distinction between someone actively, right, trying to overthrow a government, for example, right, and someone just expressing certain ideas about whatever, right, even if they are really, really disgusting ideas, right. But there is a distinction in these two sort of sets of actions, right, for which one is very dangerous, right, in the sense that if that goes through, you lose your tolerance, right? You lose everything, right? For which I think the paradox of intolerance works great, right? Because we shouldn't tolerate that type of behavior, because if we do tolerate that type of behavior, then we lose everything, as the paradox of intolerance would sort of demonstrate, right? But certain other actions, it seems to me very plausible that they could be expressed, right, or done without thereby losing everything, right? Without going into that. So I think it's much more nuanced in terms of what things about intolerant people we should tolerate, if that makes sense, right? And I just wanted, like before when I said tolerate, like if punching a Nazi, if saying punch Nazis is hate speech, right? I wanted to just point this out because so far we were saying we were using a definition about hate speech that I think would apply here, right? But I think we all would agree that there is like a bit of a difference there, right? And so my indirect question was, should there be some other parameter when it comes to hate speech that we include in these types of discussions, right? That would make it so that we can discriminate between, say, punch Nazis and a different comment about sort of like a homophobic comment, perhaps, or something else, right? So yeah, that was the implicit question.
Okay, so my solution is to not say "don't punch Nazis," and I'll leave it at that.
To not say "don't punch Nazis," to say "punch Nazis."
No. He's not saying to not say no. Come on.
I am. What I'm saying is community policing, like I was saying before.
So don't tell people not to punch Nazis, but don't tell them to. Sort of remain outwardly agnostic on the topic rather than telling them they're wrong.
Okay. That makes sense.
Look, but my whole point is that when you look at
you want no accountability, basically.
No. My point is that that in any kind of a democracy, you see that there are roughly 15% of people who have fairly unrealistic ideas about reality, right? And I'm just saying that I'm just digging a hole deeper, am I not?
Yeah, but I love it.
The point is that it sounds like I'm letting people beat other people in submission. That's exactly not what I'm saying. Let me gather my thoughts. I'll be right back with you.
Okay. So, Dave, you haven't spoken in a while. Speak your mind.
Okay, as bad as this sounds, I would say that we shouldn't be telling people to go punch Nazis. Okay. Unless they're actually actively causing harm in the community, and then you're sort of defending the community against the actions of those Nazis.
I think that is very reasonable.
Yeah, you're not encouraging violence; you're encouraging defense in the face of.
Yeah. Think of something like the Battle of Cable Street with Mosley's Nazis or Mosley's fascists in the UK. They were met with counter-protesters, and those counter-protesters went there ready for violence, but not ready to commit the opening of the violence. It wasn't until the fascists of the UK actually went and started harassing people and damaging the neighborhood that they actually engaged in combat.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of where Martin was going earlier.
That's exactly
before
what
he
I
completely
was
lost.
But it sounded really bad. The thing is 15% will always provoke. That's what I was getting to. But...
Well, I mean, you can counter these ideas by non-violent ways. I know it's satisfying to hit a Nazi and satisfying to hit a fascist, but it gives them a kind of legitimacy that they shouldn't be allowed to have. Like, well, look, they're so afraid of our ideas that they attack us. So wait until they actually start doing the damage and then fight forward with them.
And until then, attack through intuitive dance.
Yeah.
Interpretive.
Both. Intuitively interpretive dance. But yes, thank you for the correction.
That will be a new one.
I mean, it could work. You could
It could.
It's basically the Chewbacca theory, but in dance form.
The only dance I've ever interpreted was the Swan Lake, and the title gives it away. So.
So Kimmo, so we're still back in our comments. Sorry, we're quite a way back. Says how totalitarians win: turn matters of fact into questions of motive. And he says he stole that from Hannah Arendt. Sorry.
Great philosopher.
Yeah, she was. There's a couple of ideas I disagree with her about, like her idea of power isn't quite expansive enough, but she has great ideas, especially when it comes to totalitarianism and that kind of thing.
Also, she goes on in length about how Jews caused the Holocaust for quite some time. It was uncomfortable.
She's right about the banality of evil as well.
That's true. That's true. All in all, a great philosopher. Some things were just a bit iffy.
Yeah. But then it's the same with any philosopher, really, except Stephen Law, Graham Mockey.
Jordan Peterson.
Oh God!
You go.
Don't even joke. Don't even joke about that, Martin.
Remember, I said that punching people shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah. You just changed your mind on that, didn't you?
Yeah, I've just changed my mind.
One of the things, though. No, I'm not gonna say it. Never mind. No.
So there was a conversation going on in the chat room about social media and things like that, and Luke brought up that giving Holocaust deniers a platform makes the denial of the Holocaust seem like a valid concept, and I think there is some truth to that. Like, giving someone a platform where you allow them to spread clear and obvious lies almost does say, well, yeah, you've got a valid position,
Not necessarily, because you can actually refuse to platform them, and all decent kind of platforms can refuse to platform, and the only people that will platform are the people who we shouldn't be listening to anyway, and then they get grouped in with that. And if you actually block out all platforms for them to speak on and make it illegal, it has a kind of backfire effect.
Yeah. I think, Dave, you commented as something that I totally agree with, right? Like, I mean, I think this is definitely a potential effect, right? If you post a high-profile debate between these types of ideas, right, between very bad ideas, it makes them seem kind of reasonable, right? That is an effect for some people, but I think there's also the converse effect that if you don't allow that, right, if, say, a very high-profile individual, right, that I don't know, believes in flat Earth or whatever, right? I think Luke made an example like that as well, right? And says, right, I want to debate you on this, right? And you refuse, right? It can have the opposite effect, right? It can have the effect of, oh, you fear to debate me, right?
Because I know the truth.
I know the truth, right? And you are full of lies, right? And you can't even challenge me on this shit, right? And it can very easily, I think, go that route as well. And I mean, I've seen this a couple of times, I feel like. And I don't know what, at that point, right, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? And I don't know, I think I slightly lean towards the idea that it's probably better to try to have the debate and utterly destroy, if you will, like, pardon the sort of YouTube clickbaity title, right? But utterly destroy the opponent, right? I think that can have a better effect, right? You might even turn some of the people that believe this other guy, right, in your favor, right, or at least plant the seeds of doubt in their minds, right, because you get a chance to interact with them. I mean, it has the potential, at least, to improve the situation.
Philip just stepped into the Shapiro verse.
I'm sorry, what? No, I don't. Don't you dare. Don't. Okay, Jesus Christ.
No, I'm just fucking with you, man.
Another thing to remember about
I'm
something
going to start
like
talking
Holocaust
very, very fast, right? And then that is going to make me sound very, very smart as well.
Yes, and let's say a whole bunch, man.
I'm sorry, what?
And let's say that's his go-to move. Like on every policy of substance, he goes into some kind of a mathematical equation, and he goes with let's say numbers, right? So let's say 10% of people will commit suicide. Yeah. Let's say 10%, etc. No, just no.
I think his greatest achievement was the let's say that, coastal areas get flooded, right? So why wouldn't just people sell their homes and leave then, or something like that, right? On climate change, like a big brain take like that. That was like hilarious.
Everybody wants an indoor swimming pool.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like everyone is going to buy houses, right, that are underwater and flooded. I mean,
yeah,
it totally makes sense.
Yeah. Just going back to the Holocaust thing, though, something that you need to kind of remember as well about people that kind of deny the Holocaust and want to platform these people is they're not agreeing with the people based on the strength of the arguments or how good their evidence is or how good their data is. They're agreeing with it because they hate a particular group of people.
I mean, I think some
Not
of them.
necessarily.
Yeah, I think some. Yeah, Martin, I think you have the point there.
Yeah,
I agree
go
with
ahead.
you.
Oh.
No, I just want to say that I agree with you. I think like there is definitely some percentage of people that maybe they're even. I think a lot of people might hate a certain kind of group of people, right? But they definitely want to have like a reason why they hate it, right? So that they find this reason, right? And they claw themselves into this reasoning, right? But if you remove that from them, right, I think you're still doing some good, right? Because then they're sort of lost. And maybe eventually they're going to figure out that they should let go, hopefully, right?
Yeah, but they'll be the ones that are going to be platforming that kind of thing anyway, and it'll all be done underground if it's not allowed to at least bubble to the surface a little bit.
But then you lost immediately, right? Because if it doesn't get a chance to see the light of day, right, then
there's no counters to it.
There's no counters, right? It's very hard. Like in a way, it's like dealing with fear. Right, like so long as you sort of don't want to look at it, right, and fear lives where you sort of don't look, right, when you try to avoid it in a way, and when you actually look at it, right, it usually turns out to be less scary than it seems. And in the same way, I think it kind of works analogously sometimes with these types of ideas, though not always. And I think we've mentioned that a couple of times now, but there are some scenarios.
The actual conversation continued a bit as well, didn't it? So reading down, Luke was saying, teaching that there are people who believe flat Earth. Here's why they're wrong. Is different to having a televised debate with a flat earther. But I mean, this goes back into what you were saying about covering it up. People who are prone to conspiracy thoughts, if these conversations aren't allowed to happen, will carry on and say it's more evidence that flat Earth is right.
Yeah, but then also like I think it's very likely, right? I think, right, out of me, I think I've looked at like two flat Earth videos out of curiosity at the time, right? And I was wrong about why they believe what they believe, right? I was wrong. Like certain ideas, right, that they're repeated, right? But it's very easy to be wrong about why people believe the way they believe, right? And I think there's an inherent risk in what Luke is proposing there, that you might teach what you think they think and not what they actually think, or why they actually think.
That's a good point, right? Actually. I mean, so we see it again going back to like some of the atheist community online, the arguments about why people believe and things like that. I mean, we're going to be doing a stream in the future about indoctrination and things like that.
That would be nice.
So that ties into it. Sort of that I feel like a lot of us atheists go out there and spread false information about why Christians and other theists believe what they believe.
Yeah, and if we had kids, right? If we had kids, we would teach them, some people believe in God. Here's why they believe in God, right? And we would teach them wrong things, right? For a lot of people, we would teach them wrong things. And same things goes for Christians, by the way, right? They say, they're atheists, but they believe that because they
want to sin.
They love to sin, right? Or they have the devil in their heart or whatever, right? Like this stuff happens, right? When you try to represent someone else's idea that you don't agree with, right? It's very hard to do that, honestly. Like unless you have a person there to check, right, where you're steel manning them effectively, and you have to repeat what they think, is the correct version of what they believe, right? That seems to be very effective.
But
other than that, there's a very high risk that you're gonna just
misrepresent people.
Position,
and I think I mean, other than the religious notions of flat Earth, so that there are some that believe in the flat Earth because of the Bible. What were the ones that you discovered in your videos that you were?
I mean, they're usually sort of conspiracy-minded people, right? That really want to. A lot of these people seem to be motivated very much by wanting to test things themselves, right? And they're gonna like run their own experiments and stuff like that, right? That are not very much sort of rudimental and very prone to errors, right? And that probably don't show exactly what they think they show. But they like to take matters into their own hands. They like to feel like they have control. And some of them, I think, like also to believe that there is more to what seems to be known, right? Like the sense of mystery, I think, that appeals to some people, right? But this is, again, my characterization of why they believe what they believe, right? And I've come across arguments that I've never would have thought, right, about time and stuff, right? That I didn't, like, honestly, I haven't looked into these types of things, right? I didn't even know these things. And I think, like, as absurd as this might seem, right, because flat earthers, like, are the definition in some way of sort of stupidity, if you will, right? But, like, I've discovered things that I didn't know about sort of how physics works, not because I've listened to them, right, but because, for example, maybe I've listened to a debate or stuff like that, right? And there were certain things, some of them seemed informed on the current situation on some things, right? And of course, they interpreted it completely differently, right? But there were discussions about different models and stuff. And like, I'm not saying that flat Earth has any credibility, because it definitely doesn't, right? At the same time, I just my simple point was that there is more to what most people. Not to flat Earth, not that there is more to flat Earth, but that there are reasons that you cannot imagine for why people believe what they believe, and that you trying to figure out why they believe in projecting that onto them is sometimes gonna just not represent them correctly, right? And then you're just entering the echo chamber essentially, and I think that is a risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've stunned us into silence, Philip. I think that means we agree.
Yeah, well, this also goes towards the thing I said earlier about these kinds of conspiracies all being geared towards the primary biases that you have. I mean, you'll find that the factual information, like when they actually cite studies or scientists or things like that their claims are correct. It's just their interpretation of the facts that isn't correct. I mean, they don't take the context into account a lot of the time, but they also don't cross-reference with other studies, et cetera, et cetera. The studies they cite, they're correct, and they have the findings they typically claim to have. Or they botch the claim, but you see where the point used to be, right? It means typically that they've heard it from others and they've gotten the links from other people, but it still makes the same sort of sense. And that's why these kinds of conspiracies are so convincing to a lot of people. I understand that part as well, but these people are the 15% of people I was just referencing, right? They have a point, and I understand where they're coming from. The point is actually, like the popular culture says, is they all say you should do your own research, but they basically use someone else's research. And the person whose research they're using is not the greatest student, basically.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to, and it's very appealing, because another thing of these times is that people just want to feel special because they're left out in the cold, basically. And that's a very red statement of mine. So
there's also a community forming aspect there, right? Like you can form communities with people that you agree with then, and just bitch about how stupid everyone else is, because you know the truth, right, about this situation, right, and everyone else doesn't get it. I mean, but these types of things exist at both sides of the spectrum, I think, right? I think it's very dangerous to assume that you're not capable of being in these types of scenarios with your own beliefs, right? I think, like, at least I find for myself, right, that I trust a lot of people, for example, that seem trustworthy to me, right? But these types of mechanics, right, exist on the other side as well, right? Like, these people also trust other people that they imbue with trust, right? So there's a lot of parallelism there, right, in terms of how we form the beliefs that we have. And I think, like, the best cure for this is to be as aware as possible of all of these sorts of things that exist within human nature. That sort of, I think we had this discussion already at some point in the past on a stream, right? How biases work and all of these types of things, right? And how to be rational and all of these things. But I don't see another way out other than sort of trying to be aware of this thing and not thinking that you are some kind of like God that understood this type of stuff, and now you realize that you're in the matrix now, and now you're immune of everything, right? Because I think that's the point where you're starting to make a mistake, right? And you should be aware of these things and should sort of, also try to figure out where you are making these mistakes, because you probably are making these mistakes in reasoning, right? So, I guess that's the only way I can see forward. Of course, then there are also psychological aspects to it, but we already mentioned some of those.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Okay.
Awesome. So moving on with the chat, I've been trying to go through whilst you guys were engaged in conversation. And pick out of the 100 and something odd messages that I'd missed whilst we were talking before, pick out some of the better ones. So this one from Kimmo, I think, actually is quite a good question. Not necessarily completely related to tonight, but it definitely is. So how do you determine who or what is adequately qualified to teach critical thought or strategies to citizens?
Yeah, that's a very good one.
Because if no one's got any critical thinking skills, how can anyone adequately critically think?
Like, I think. Sorry, go ahead, Dave. You...
I was just going to crack a joke and say we should just hand it all over to Randolph Richardson.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
I have no idea who that is, but I believe I encountered some hate speech about him earlier tonight.
It's not hate speech; it's just general mockery.
I think. I mean,
he said after the fact. Sorry, Philip. I just needed to let that.
No, go ahead. That's fine. I mean, if you can, I think the only qualification that you really need is just to read sort of yourlogicalfallacies.com and you could go, more or less, right? Like, that's critical thinking, right? If you can scream strawman and sort of
ad hominem.
Ad hominem, especially ad hominem, right? Then you're good to go. Then you're skeptical, critical thinker, right?
Ad hominem.
No, but I mean, jokes aside, I think any individual, right, that you're going to pick out is going to be flawed, right? That's fair to say. But I think the body of knowledge that humanity has accumulated over time about reasoning and about flaws in reasoning and all of that seems to be very unbiased, right? Because it's not any given individual, right? It's about the overall knowledge that we acquired over time about reasoning and about flaws in reasoning and all of that, right? So any individual that is informed on that topic, right, and that teaches that, and just as a transfer of knowledge, right, to its students, I think seems to be qualified to me to teach about critical thinking and reasoning and all of that stuff.
Teach us
that would be
about
my
reason
standard.
and the reasoning process rather than what is
Yeah.
right and wrong. Like, doesn't
because
actually put
it's-
any of their own bias into it.
Yeah, exactly, right? You would essentially communicate what we have learned as the human species on reasoning. That you would forward that. That's your job.
There's a name for people like that, isn't there?
Teachers.
No, not just teachers. Philosophers?
But I mean, most people who are qualified to be teachers generally have gone through at least some level of university where they've learned critical thinking skills. So the point
I mean,
is,
I think that would, depending on what you do at university.
I mean, my sister's a teacher, and I'd probably disagree with that. But
if you're focusing on particular critical thinking skills in, say, middle school, you're probably going to be getting teachers who have actually got an education in that. So as long as they've got an education in it, then they seem to be at least reasonably qualified to at least teach the basics of it.
I'm not. I don't. I really am personally very skeptical about that. Like from what I've seen all over the place, especially in my experience with school and stuff like that, I think nobody has ideas about what it means to sort of teach critical thinking. Like everyone believes that they do, and they're extremely good critical thinkers, right? But very rarely do you actually find someone that actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to critical thinking, in terms of like that they know sort of like basic principles of logic, or that they know basic epistemology and all of that, right? I don't know. I feel like that should be required. And as someone mentioned in the chat, I think like the function of public schools should be to teach critical thinking, but I think
Kimo responded to that and saying people expect a lot from their public schools, but Luke turned around and said, I think it's as simple as stopping teaching to pass exams and instead teaching people to break down texts and form their own opinions based on evidence. Now, you do sort of start to learn stuff like that where, whether it's in drama or English literature, where you're supposed to be analysing to start with, like things like poems, right, or plays, and try and elicit the information and various inferences, and this seems to be how they were feeling, and this sound seems to have the assonance of rattling guns and all that sort of stuff. But it needs to be applied on a breaker scale, so it needs to be just more than these poems and plays. It needs to be a lot more real world application, because I don't think people actually apply this skill that they've learned from looking at poems and plays to the real world in general, unless they find this sort of analysis enjoyable. But it needs to go on from there as well. I think people need to be, going back to what we said a few minutes ago, taught about different forms of reasoning and ways to reason and in an unbiased way. So I agree with what Luke's saying there about stopping, teaching people to just pass exams, to learn to recycle information, to actually learn and reason. Like, education has to be somewhat more open to a personal interpretation based on the evidence, but there still needs to be a right and wrong in there as well. So it's a bit of a difficult one, especially for like a primary school to do. I don't know how you would teach kids of that age how to...
Why the hell would you?
Well, yeah. But
yeah,
that's sort of what I'm saying.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what I'm saying. Like, I think you could probably have some form of ethical learning and things like that at a younger age. I mean, people do learn that sort of thing from a young age, just a basic version. But I don't think you can necessarily fully enforce these sorts of deductive and inductive forms of reasoning that people can do in a child, not to the degree that we'd expect an adult to have, but it needs to come in that secondary school or high school or wherever you are in the world, maybe even middle school if you have that school system where it's split into 3 schools.
I know, we do. Okay.
You Americans, you.
No. I walk on clogs and I make cheese and I'm fucking proud of it.
Like I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. I think maybe I'm sort of deluded on this point a bit because I overestimate what you can sort of learn in elementary school. But I think like if we teach people math right from a very young age, I think we can teach people logic from a very young age. Right? It doesn't need to be very complicated, right? But you can start slow and build it up. And I think this should be absolutely required in public education, because we want to teach people how to analyze arguments. We want to teach people how arguments work, what arguments are, how to structure them, how to think about them, and all of that, because it's going to make a difference, I think, in the way people are sort of analyzing what other people are saying and the quality of our conversations, even though they might become a bit more pedantic, maybe a tiny bit. But I think overall it's going to be like a good thing for people. It is a good thing for people to know how these things work, I think, and then decide for themselves like how much they want to employ that. But I think the tools should be there, and I don't see any good reason why we deem mathematics and literature to be like fundamental to the human experience so much that we enforce them from a very young age, but not like the basics of how fucking reasoning works. Sorry if I get, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are being taught the basics of how reasoning works by learning things like maths and the English literature analysis and things like that. You're just not explicitly learning it; you're implicitly,
and that's the problem.
Yeah, that's that I was about to say, right? Like, I think honestly, I don't think people understand like how like inferences work even, right? Like if they don't touch this sort of thing, right? They're going to use inferences for sure, right? And they're going to be sort of intuitively using them as everyone does, right? But I think like adding a layer of understanding is going to inherently give an advantage to people to be able to analyze them, because there are inferences that seem intuitive to us that are not good, right? And we see this all the time with like formal fallacies if you talk about deductive inferences, right? Like they happen all the time. They happen in media all the time, but people don't realize them because they're not used to sort of see these patterns of reasoning in the things that they are saying, right? But if you start to look at these and decode arguments through this lens, I think it's much easier to pick up on these sort of patterns, and that's what all it is, right? That's pattern recognition of sort of how these things are structured.
Here's a problem with that. This is all kind of abstract thought, and we know that biologically, for as far as I know, by the way, this may be evolved science at this point, but from what I've been taught, your capacity for abstract language biologically gets completed at around the age of 25. I don't see a lot of people going to school until 25 to, grasp what they're being taught. I mean, if I look back for myself, I never understood math. I really didn't. I graduated on it. That wasn't the problem. I knew the individual formulas I had to use. I didn't understand it. Now, as I read that this kind of capacity was finished at around 25, at 23, I believe, I tried my hand at my old math book, and I literally understood it. I understood what the calculations themselves were doing. You see, that's basically the big problem with a lot of things that we are teaching now, is that we are teaching them way too early, because we are adults looking at children. And we forget that, for instance, the children of 8 that we start to teach math, they don't really have a full grasp of object permanence yet. They don't really know what happens when they manipulate an object. Not really. They know how to, and they will see the results and they will play with the results, but they don't know exactly what's going to happen. You see, I think we're cramming a lot of more advanced things into children's education than we should be, and thereby raising the stakes too much. I also think that that's the reason why people go into a burnout younger and younger every year. I think that may be a cause.
Well, again,
And
because I think part of that
starting
is
over.
I think part of that is the focus on passing the exams for these things rather than learning these things. Like, and I know, like, to prove that you've learnt them is to pass the exam, but actually having the skill, the applicable skill, is more important than passing the exam to say you've done it, because there are certain people who learn
Really?
to recycle the information really well, right? And so they have all the doors open to them because they've got the qualifications, right? Because they've learned to recycle information, right? There are some subjects where you can just recycle and win, if you will. And I think that is something that is taught, and I don't think that's necessarily right, because you can have people who are very good at recycling information but don't have any understanding of what they've learnt, and therefore they're pretty useless at their job.
Right, but looking at that, one of the things first is imagine doing things but not knowing why you're doing them and what they do.
Yeah, that's like
Yeah.
every day.
But you're in IT, you don't count. No, but you do understand that even though things may be going well for you, you may be still uncertain of it. You may know that you have a grasp on them, but they're still uncertain. You understand that is not something you want to do something you love, I would say, right? And let alone that it's probably not a very good place to learn from, is it? So I think you should first. That's one of my pet things from also years ago, by the way. I'm a great proponent of mastery-based learning. So what you do is you have certain classes, right? And you can still divide them up into schools if you want, but I'm not really a great proponent of that. But you let a child take its time before it grasps every part of of something they have to do, right? So someone could be in 5th grade when it comes to language, 3rd grade when it comes to fucking maths,
There are schools like
5th
that,
grade when it comes to history, etc., etc. As long as before the end of their school they have a minimum amount of grasping and a minimum amount of understanding of a certain subject before
And
they
I
can
agree with
move
you.
on, right?
There are actually schools like that. They're very expensive, unfortunately, but it's almost children-led learning. They go to a school and they play, and if there's anything that interests them, they can sort of ask to learn about it. And it's still relatively new, so we don't know if it's actually going to be productive. But I think it would be, because it's encouraging the individual to learn about the things that interest them and that are going to help them in their future life, because they're going to have a more rewarding life. If they happen to have, a keen interest in something like history and don't really care about anything else, well, then they can spend a lot of their time learning all about history, and there will be other skills that are involved in there, like English skills and some critical thinking skills about looking the evidence and so on and so forth. But it will be the focus that they're actually truly interested in, and I think that's a really great way to learn. But again, should that start at what age should that start? I don't know. It's been so long since I've been, a 5-year-old that I don't know what would have really worked best for me.
Well,
I can look at it pie in the sky, but
I'd say that if you're honest and if you're fair, that this is just a trajectory that an idea that you can start immediately. And it will show in the child some sort of proclivities, right? And I mean, for instance, the child is very interested in, I don't know, just fucking drawing or something, right? So then you introduce them to painting, and they might like painting, and then you can think, well, one of the things that we are supposed to learn them, because that's one of the mandatory courses, because I do think there should be some mandatory courses, right?
Okay.
You will show them like the way society is structured, right? And then the child might eventually blossom into a great artist, but they might also halfway through decide that they don't give a fuck about fucking art and people or whatever, and become a scientist or a philosopher or whatever. The point is to facilitate someone to have their own growth instead of having state mandatory growth. And I'm going to tell you that this, just like any other kind of political policy, will mean that you have to sacrifice something. In this case, it will be economic growth. We will all have to be a whole lot less efficient about this. And we will have to accept that. But we will all be happier because of it.
yeah, that's fair. Luke's actually made a comment.
Sorry.
This is a little while ago as well. Obviously, I'm still going back through the historical comments. I will get to the new ones that are coming in. I see you all posting, but I'm behind on the times. So Luke actually, who appears to have dropped back in the chat. Good timing, Luke. But he says, problem is governments like the Tories only want to train 1% to lead their country in their stead. They don't care about educating the entire population. And I think you do see that with certain types of schooling and the syllabus that's provided. And I think what we were sort of talking about there would negate this issue, but I think it would also be quite expensive to do. And I don't know how we'd expect publicly funded schools to work in this way, at least with the funding they currently get. They do need more funding. Agreed. I think education and things like the NHS definitely should have more funding so that they can be better than they are now. They need to be better than they are now. They're definitely subpar. But how do you get to it?
I get that. Yeah, I get to it, but it's a real big tangent. So it's just what you want, man.
Does it involve a lot of anarchy?
No, not necessarily. It involves just expressing that our societies may have lost what the point of a society is. Fair. So the whole point is that we can all be happier. That's the whole point of a society. That's all.
That's what they tell us anyway.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful part. What do we tend to do? We focus on the fucking economy. The economy doesn't interest fucking poor people. I'm gonna tell you that. That doesn't matter. We can be the poorest country in the world, and we can still all have fairly decent lives as long as we spread the wealth decently. because in the end, economics is a comparative business.
Yeah, that's fair.
But again, rent over.
Luke also brought up a point saying this is tying into the holding politicians accountable for the lies that they've made, and it was in question to how can you tell if someone knew that they were lying? So Boris Johnson said he knew nothing about the parties at Downing Street. Boris Johnson was fined for being at the parties in Downing Street. Boris Johnson lied. And I mean, this is the sort of thing which I think that, you know, when it's something so blatantly proven as that, they shouldn't just receive a fine. They should, at the very least, no longer be allowed to be a politician.
Wouldn't normal people also just receive a fine?
No. So they're lying to the public. They're
lying to the public. Yeah, sure. But the problem is that as long as you are willing to have a democracy, which as long as we all agree to have a government, I do agree with, right? So as long as you're wanting to, you're gonna have to, at the very least, treat them in a way that is acceptable, that is enticing for people to run as a candidate. And when people are going to be held responsible for things that are normal in a governmental sense, which simply is that you lie to the people, as literally every government in the world is doing that to their people at this very moment, then you are basically telling someone, yeah, we will let you exercise your profession. But at the same time, we're going to hold you accountable for having you exercise your profession. You see what you're doing there?
Yeah, I don't agree that they should be able to do that, though. I think the profession needs a complete overhaul. I mean, I think government needs a complete overhaul, but there's a big difference between.
But then you're getting to the point that you're asking, for instance, the European Union to disclose what kind of arms they are at this moment giving to Ukraine, which means that you are also...
No, because there's a difference between outright lying and withholding the truth, right? That was the point that was brought up earlier. I think something unsaid is very different to something promoted, and I think again there are certain things that shouldn't be left unsaid, like for example, we want you all to take this medication, but actually 50% of you will die. Well, okay, you need to qualify that with 50% of you will die if you take it. You can't leave that 50% out. But with this sort of thing, like his outright saying he knew nothing about the parties in Downing Street, and then there's video evidence of him actually being there.
I agree, but okay, let's just simplify it a bit, right? Do you agree that some things about governing a country ought to be cloak and dagger?
If we're talking about withheld information,
not just withheld information, things like, for instance, we all know that, for instance, the Ukrainian government has been using Western media to spread their propaganda, which I personally support Ukraine. That's not the problem here. So I also support their propaganda. That's the thing. But do you think that sometimes you should lie to not necessarily your own people, but the people outside your country? Because if you're going to need to lie to people outside your country, and you also have to specifically tell the truth to people in your country, you're going to be fucked.
I don't know. is the best answer I can give you there. I need to think on that one more, and I don't have the brain power at this time of night to think on it enough. My gut reaction is no, I don't think there should be lies anywhere. But that's a gut reaction. That's not a considered response.
Well, it's a considered response if every country would adhere to what you think.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then I would agree with you, but every country doesn't.
No, they're all bastards. Damn countries.
Exactly.
Yeah. Lone Wolf says, should a person be held to the standard of a malicious lie if they are wrong about a thing and just being myopic? No. Quick answer there.
Yeah, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
I'm going to say at least for once, though, because it will be funny. That's all. I personally enjoy it.
Oh yeah, so Lone Wolf also says, oh my god, that's what gets me, Martain. Intentionally misleading rhetoric. I so wish they could cart Trump off for all the misleading BS he spread for so many years. So, and I this ties into the persistent lying that he did, and he also got a rise out of people. You know, I mean, would it be fair to say that he was at least part of the root cause of the riots in January?
First of all, prepare for 4 more years. And yes, it was. I believe. I am very certain that this was sort of literally proven. I'm not certain, but I can remember watching a video that cited that's the problem with this memory. A video that cited an article that I didn't read. I'll be honest about that. That said that Trump had messages on some of his phones about the whole 9/11. No, not the 9/11 thing. The whole January 6th thing, right? That he had contacts with them. That being said, I also know that that exact time now is under investigation, so I should probably shut up. That's also a thing. I don't want to be a conspiracy fueler or whatever. Both ways. Even though I am very much left. You may all know that. I'm very much left. But I'm not going to. No. Okay, that's it.
I mean, there's. I'm just going through the chat. There's a lot of. What do we say? Comments. That's the word. I couldn't think of the word. There's been a lot of comments, and I do apologize that I haven't got to all of them. So if anyone has anything they want us to address, please at me right now in the chat, and I will address them. There is LB says American education is a joke. I did actually go to school in America for a year, and it was definitely very different to what I had experienced in the UK. I felt that there was I'd gone back sort of a few years. So out there, they start school a year later anyway. So I was in a year lower than I would have been, and it definitely did feel like a few years before. And when you did like things like geography and history and stuff like that, it was all American geography and American history, and there wasn't much learning about the rest of the world. Now, this is obviously only 1 year in 8th grade, so
no. I have never been to America, but I dare say that any report that I have heard from Americans, literally just education-wise, it's American first from what I've heard.
Yeah. And maybe that's part of the patriotic attitude a lot of them have, because they're all taught America, fuck yeah. Hey. So carrying on through the chat, I think that we've got through most of the important messages there. There were, a ton more. I do apologize that we didn't get to any of them, but there is one last topic that I did mention that we were going to briefly cover off. So this was, has free speech actually been weaponized? And that was something you wanted to talk about, Dave. You're muted, Dave.
Yeah.
Sorry, the little preview box popped up over the mute button, and I couldn't actually get to it, and the preview box didn't disappear. Yeah, typical. Yeah. If you think back to something like Britain First and EDL, and even today, people like James Lindsay, and you have others doing this, where they argue about how their free speech is being broken down and people should have free speech. And free speech is this idea that everyone sort of holds to, unless you're in a country where free speech isn't seen as something worthy of holding. And they use that to say whatever they want. And people see them as kind of protectors of free speech and champions of free speech. But in the background, they're kind of trying to shut arguments down. Like if you think about them trying to shut down CRT, and if you complain about it, people generally don't listen to you because they've already been convinced that this person is for free speech, and maybe these things aren't worthy of being taught anyway. And I think free speech is kind of being weaponized in that sense.
It's, or something under the guise of free speech, which actually isn't free speech.
yeah, basically.
Yeah, I think we already mentioned some of that at the beginning, right? When we were talking about like free from being criticized, right? Being conflated with free speech.
Yeah, well, the thing is, in this day and age, basically everything is weaponized, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I just read a fucking article about people getting fined 90 fucking euros for leaving their electric car on a loading pole for an hour too long. I mean, what the fuck are we talking about?
Yeah, I
mean, everything is weaponized these days, man.
You're right. I mean, like you have said before, actually, Martin, everything is a stick that we use to beat each other with. But in the subject of free speech, how would you even? He's harmless. How would you actually go about addressing something like that, though, Dave?
I'm not really sure. That's kind of difficult. It's not really something I've thought about a lot. It's just this is a pattern that I've started to see happening, or like people using the idea of free speech to promote bad ideas.
Yeah.
And like I say, it's not really something I thought about, but it's something that needs to be watched out for to be combated by people much smarter than me.
Yeah, I suppose even then it goes back to like one of the early examples that we did say at the beginning about, Oman, using free speech to justify anything he said. And instead of actually having a good argument or being able to present anything, I mean, you could even say that was a form of weaponization and misrepresentation of what free speech is supposed to be. Can free speech be weaponized whilst not being misrepresented?
Yes.
Okay, how?
One of the things is the whole cancel culture thing, right? I mean, people are complaining about the whole cancel culture, and ironically, oftentimes on TV, whilst bitching about not being allowed on TV. But it is a thing. I mean, I wouldn't say cancel culture is a thing necessarily, but that's a whole other issue. But what was the question again? I'm flaking, man. What was the question again?
Can free speech be weaponized without being misrepresented?
Yeah, no. So that is the thing, right? These people are complaining about their free speech being impeded, and like I said earlier, I do agree with that in the sense that they are sort of prohibited temporarily in many cases, but still, from participating in the public discourse. And I do think that they have a right to complain about that, right? And in that way, their freedom of speech is being weaponized to combat something they perceive to be an injustice. And I do think it is sort of adequately represented, even though some people really do transgress into calling laws into question, and that's where you're going wrong. Because I think we have here tonight at least established that there's a difference between moral and legal freedom of speech.
Yeah, I think so. I'd agree with that. Dave, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Sorry, my internet glitched and I missed most of that. I'm sorry.
That's too bad. The point is, there's a difference between legal and moral the freedom of speech. That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
So Kimmo has a point. There's the last couple of points tonight saying it's puzzling that a lot of people believe that their education stinks, but they'll ardently defend what they've learned within that milieu. That's interesting, actually. This is very true. I actually think I had a lot of good opportunities within my education, but I think I squandered them. So I'm on the opposite end of that one.
But I think you can criticize the way education works, right? The way education delivers the information without being necessarily suspicious of the information itself that you get delivered, right? Like you can be happy with the knowledge that you have acquired, whilst criticizing the way you acquired that knowledge, right? If it doesn't impact, like if it's not a critique that is necessarily impacting the quality of the knowledge that you're getting, then I don't see a conflict there. It's just like the way it was presented to you and the way you had to learn it was like perhaps not optimal. I think a lot of people recognize that.
Sit down, shut up, copy off the board, rinse and repeat. That's not necessarily optimal for understanding the topic, and it might not be till a few years later where you have that's what that meant, even if you knew how to recycle everything on that.
Yeah, also like it seems like a lot of people mentioned this, right? But like just a lot of education just seems prepping for exams and in some form or another. And the moment you're done with that, you completely erase it from memory and prepare for the next one, right? And so like I think there are legitimate questions here about the utility of these types of sort of things. Like maybe something sticks, right? But like a lot of things.
Yeah, like the square root of 196.
Yeah, that's
It's 14. That's about it. That's all I remember from school.
We should just teach children physics by letting them skate.
By letting them skate?
Awesome. Yeah, why not?
And push each other out down hills.
You just have them drop themselves from fucking vert ramps and shit, and you'll be like, well, that's how gravity works, children. That's plenty.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So, were there any other points that you folks wanted to raise tonight? I know we've covered a lot about free speech and education, apparently, which has been interesting. And maybe we need to investigate more on the education front, and obviously more on the politics and government front in the future as well, which I know will moisten Martein's loins. But was there anything else you guys wanted to raise tonight?
I don't think so from my side.
No,
Not really.
no, nothing from me. It was a good, fun discussion, though. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, and thank you all three of you for joining us tonight. It's been really, really interesting. You've been watching the SciPhi stream on freedom of speech, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Obviously, thank you, all three of you, for joining us, and thank you everybody out there in the chat. We've really appreciated having you here. And you've been watching the SciPhi stream. I'm Joe.
I'm Dave.
I'm Martijn.
And I'm Philip.
Have yourselves a good night.
Good night, all.